In this edition of George Washington Speaks, we will see that the skirmishes between the English colonists and the French along the frontier continued. The British began to realize that the individual colonies needed to have a more unified approach, especially if the British were going to continue to expand westward and push out the French. In 1754, a pivotal event took place that would set the stage for the American colonies over the next 20 years and beyond, the Albany Plan of Union. This meeting included representatives from 7 colonies, along with approximately 150 members of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. The meeting was intended to start a conversation about a common government, supposedly for the protection and defense against the French to the west of the colonies. The plan was ironically signed on July 4th in 1754, and it was ultimately rejected by the British government because they felt that the plan gave too much power to the colonies and decreased the authority and control of the Crown. At nearly the same time, the British government took a more aggressive stance against the French, since the French had built 4 forts in the Ohio Valley and had attacked Washington at Fort Necessity. Britain felt that the war was imminent, and the Crown sent General Edward Braddock, a commander with more than 40 years' experience, to the New World to lead an attack on the French.
General Braddock and 2 Irish regiments arrived in Hampton Roads, Virginia, in the winter of 1755. It was the first British force ever sent to the colonies. After several colonial governors met with General Braddock, they agreed with a 4-part plan that Britain had developed to repel the French. They would send forces to attack the French in 4 different locations: Fort Beauséjour in Nova Scotia, Crown Point on Lake Champlain in New York, Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario in New York, and the all-important attack on Fort Duquesne in the Ohio Valley. Having developed respect for General Braddock, and because of my previous missions to the region, I joined his expedition westward. But we soon discovered that the troops lacked some of the necessary material for such an expedition. Through the assistance of one gentleman from Pennsylvania named Benjamin Franklin, the general agreed to contract with the colonials for supplies rather than simply seizing the property from them. As a result, we were able to secure 150 Conestoga wagons with 4 horses and 1 driver, and 1,500 saddle and pack horses from local Pennsylvania farmers and merchants. Lieutenant Colonel Gage led the force of men who would clear a 12-foot wide roadway through the wilderness to allow the troops, artillery, and wagons heavy with equipment, along with nearly 2,200 men, to make our way to Fort Duquesne.
Young Washington had earned a good reputation despite his youth, and I was glad to have him in my command. But he was headstrong and had his own ideas about battle, despite having limited battle experience. Washington enlisted the assistance of many Indians and did not want his Virginians to march in formation through the wilderness. I would not have a green colonist question my judgment or experience. So I dismissed this Indian's guides and insisted that his Virginians march along with my troops rather than the woods along the roadway.
Since a road had to be cut through the wilderness, the army and its artillery and supply wagons moved painfully slowly. Trees needed to be felled, stumps removed, and the ground prepared for the heavy-wheeled wagons and artillery. Creeks and bogs and wetlands had to be crossed where they could not be skirted. But the biggest challenge was constructing the long switchbacks that went up and then down the sides of many of the hills and mountains, so that the draft animals could handle them without becoming exhausted or even dying from the extreme effort. Another difficulty was the makeup and length of the supply train that extended 4 miles behind the main military force. Besides the army itself, there were over 500 non-combatants that needed to be transported, clothed, and fed all along the way. They were civilian laborers, axemen, and teamsters, the wives and children of many of the officers and soldiers, servants and slaves, and female camp followers that were cooks, nurses, and washerwomen. We left Wills Creek on the Potomac River in early June. The British plan, which was developed by a group of men in London with no experience in the colonies, anticipated that we would reach Fort Duquesne in 3 to 4 days. However, a month later, we arrived at the Monongahela River, still about 10 miles short of our target, Fort Duquesne. There I witnessed the most impressive spectacle of British troops that I had captured in my diary. And this is what I saw. Every man was neatly dressed in full uniform. The soldiers were arranged in columns and marched in exact order. The sun was gleaming off their shiny arms. The river flowed tranquilly on their right. The next day, Colonel Gage and his men formed a flying column that moved quickly without any equipment or packs. It moved ahead of the main body of the regiment and support column. Within a couple of miles, it walked into an ambush, and it faced fierce musket fire. Because the French and Indians used the terrain, boulders, and trees so effectively, the soldiers could not see anyone that was shooting at them. They returned fire blindly into the woods, but their musket balls, even their artillery fire, failed to find any of the Indians or French that were hiding in the dense wood. As they lined up shoulder to shoulder in lines of 12 abreast, as they had been taught to do in the open fields of Europe, they were easily and quickly picked off by the camouflaged enemy. The officers on horseback also became the targets, and they too fell, either killed or wounded. Having heard the fighting, General Braddock moved 400 of his men from the main army forward as quickly as he could. At the same time, without the mounted officers in the advanced guard to direct and encourage the men, and given that the soldiers were falling so quickly to an unseen enemy, the ranks broke, and they began to run for their lives back to the rear. As Braddock pushed forward with his 400 men to aid Gage, they encountered this routed infantry, which threw both groups into confusion and panic. They could neither charge the enemy nor return fire. However, my Virginians kept their presence of mind, and immediately they started taking shelter behind trees and began to return fire with very good effect. Braddock, however, drove the Virginians back to the British lines with the regulars with the flat of his sword to maintain British order. I must admit, Braddock and the officer were fearless in battle. In the course of 3 terrible hours of continual fighting, 73 of the 86 mounted officers were either killed or wounded. Braddock himself had 5 horses shot from underneath him, and then he was shot through the arm and the lungs. Seeing that all was lost, he entrusted me to carry his orders to the various areas of battle to retreat. Once the army saw retreat, they broke and ran. I tried to rally them at the banks of the Monongahela, but to no avail. It fell to me to make an orderly retreat after that. It was only by God's providence that I was saved from being shot by the musket balls coming from the forest. Of 1,400 soldiers, 930 were either killed or wounded. Approximately 70% of more than 1,000 officers and soldiers were either killed or wounded in that conflict. It was the worst defeat the British military had ever sustained in its long history anywhere. In comparison, among our enemy, a mere 40 French and Indian combatants were killed or wounded.
Upon the fall of General Braddock, Washington took command of the Virginia Regiment and allowed them to take shelter behind trees and return fire. The British regulars, seeing that General Braddock and most of our officers except Washington had been wounded or killed, immediately took flight and abandoned their provisions, weapons, wagons, and artillery. Fortunately, the Indian fighters stopped fighting and started seizing the highly prized knives, muskets, hats, coats, and other items left behind, and they took many scalps of the killed and wounded and did not pursue the fleeing British troops. We later learned of atrocities that the Indians committed on their prisoners, evils that I won't describe here. It was a terrible defeat.
15 years later, and 7 years after the French had given the Ohio Valley to Britain, I returned to the Ohio country and was south of the Monongahela. I was traveling with my personal physician, Dr. Crake, who I had known since childhood, and a group of fellow soldiers. An older sachem from the area learned of my presence, and he traveled to meet us with a delegation of elders and braves from his tribe. We shared a council fire, and the chief told us that he had been one of the Indians that was raining the fury of musket balls upon us. And here was his words to me.
It was on the day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest that I first beheld the chief. I called to my young men, "Quick, let your aim be certain," and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, but 'twas all in vain. A power mightier than we shielded you. Seeing you were under special guardianship of the Great Spirit, we ceased to fire at you. I said, "He will become a chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as a father of a mighty empire." I am come to pay homage to the man who is a particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle.
The Battle of Monongahela was a pivotal point in George Washington's military career and reputation. After his surrender at Fort Necessity, young Washington's reputation as a commander could have been called into question. But the bravery he exhibited under the command of General Braddock, as attested to by the colonial and British survivors, erased any doubts about Washington's ability to command in a battle situation. The seemingly unconventional approach to battle, taking shelter behind rocks and trees, not marching in formation into battle, and enlisting the assistance of the native tribes as scouts and warriors, were practices he continued to refine for the next decade into his Revolutionary War battles, and enhanced his already significant personal reputation as a military leader and a leader of men. Let's take a look at some discussion questions for this segment of George Washington Speaks. What does the word providence mean? And how is it applicable to our lives today? George Washington had unique experience of fighting in the wilderness, but General Braddock chose not to take Washington's advice. What is the best course of action when dealing with others if you truly believe your approach is best, and others are having a hard time accepting that? Do you think when George Washington was carrying out the orders from General Braddock and riding back and forth on the battlefield that he was brave, scared, or both? Washington took an unconventional approach to battle, at least in the minds of the more conservative British officers. Can you cite any contemporary examples of how a reasoned and unconventional approach led to success in the area of leadership? From a historical perspective, what is the irony of the Battle of Monongahela in the context of the later battles between the British and the colonists in the Revolutionary War? Do you think that the fact that all the other officers in the battle, except for Washington, were killed or wounded is luck, skill, or providence?